Hey there. If you enjoy my work, please take a moment to like the video. I need your help if I'm going to resurrect this channel. What do you do if the only thing standing between you and a hulking monster is a flimsy piece of plywood? How about if you're confronted by an eldritch horror on your way home on a rainy night? Oh yeah, and also, you're 10 years old in both these scenarios. Listen to these stories and find out. Dear Mr. X, my name is Brian. Something strange and terrifying happened to my younger sister and I on an old logging trail in Oregon. I grew up in a very odd family, to put it politely. We've always been very poor, and my mother's relationship with her husband has been rocky at best. They've been separated on and off many times throughout the years. Exactly when I came into the picture is a matter of debate, and as a result, I happen to be what they call a bastard. My siblings and I have been getting bounced back and forth between one parent's custody and the other for about as long as any of us can remember. Despite the fact that my mother loved us to death, she had a hard time keeping herself out of jail, which ended up with us kids being shipped back to Dad. My dad, as you'll soon see, is a self-proclaimed hobo/nomad. We spent many of our youthful years living with him, traveling up and down the state of Oregon, hitchhiking from place to place. Eventually, my dad somehow came into possession of an old beat-up car that served as our home. 4 kids and 1 man living in a crappy sedan. Being the oldest of the bunch, I often played the role of protector when my dad wasn't around, which was pretty often. Eventually, he started running out of money and decided to move us up into the mountains of Klamath Falls. A friend of his told him about an abandoned shack out in the woods along an old logging trail. We found the shack and holed up there. One day, my dad and my brother Dan went into town to get some supplies, leaving me with my other brother Eric and my sister Jackie. We were still just kids, so we were able to have plenty of fun while living out in the woods, despite the harsh conditions. After all, I'm pretty sure that most kids could only dream of being able to live out in the wilderness like that, albeit preferably under more pleasant circumstances. I can't pretend it was fun living with chipmunks and other nuisances constantly nibbling at our few possessions, though. It's important to note that we were in a dangerously shoddy wooden shack with paper-thin walls. It was probably about the size of a very small bedroom. It was really only worth living there because it was roomier than the car and had a decent roof on it. The door was nothing but a single piece of warped plywood. After my dad left us alone, Eric and I sat on the couch that was against the back wall of the shack, reading old magazines while Jackie played with a couple of dolls on the floor. Eric shot up when we heard the sound of something like a branch breaking off a tree. I whispered for him to stay silent as I slowly raised myself up off the dilapidated cushion, straining to listen through the light, creaking noises of the couch's stale wooden frame as I scooted closer to the wall. Again, the wall itself was really nothing more than about an inch of plywood. Eric sat anxiously, frozen solid with fright and confusion. Another snap cut through the stagnant air. This time, I could tell for sure that the sound was coming from behind the house. A third cracking noise rang out, followed immediately by a fourth, making me flinch away from the wall. More noises began to fill the air, each one louder and closer than the last. Acting instinctively to protect my siblings, I sank down to the floor, yanking Eric down with me toward Jackie. I pulled the ratty knit blanket over our heads, a super effective hiding place in the minds of children. I still remember the blue light filtering through the fabric, tinting everything under the blanket, as we sat motionless, waiting for whatever was outside to pass us by. To our horror, the snapping appeared to stop just outside the wall behind us. Whatever it was close enough to grab us if it wanted to. It started walking again, seemingly tracing the borders of the shack. It stopped again in front of the door. I looked out through the blanket to see what I could. The sun's rays peered back at me through the holes in the rotted-out walls of our makeshift home. It was only then that I noticed I could no longer hear the noises of birds or other animals in the woods. The normally lush soundscape of the mountains had gone completely dark. The air felt thick and heavy. Something was standing just outside the door. After what felt like hours, the sound of something massive walking erupted again. This time, returning on the path it came from. That's actually all I remember of that day, but it remains one of the most vivid and terrifying memories I've ever experienced. Sincerely, Brian. Story number 2. Dear Mr. X, my name is Mark. I live in the UK and am currently a history teacher. I just celebrated my 29th birthday. I recently saw your video on alien encounters and I couldn't help but remember back to a rather odd event from nearly 20 years ago. I know it may seem unreal, but I remember every detail with intense clarity. It's really quite scary. The year was 1998 or 99, around late autumn. I recall the trees being almost bare, with night falling early around 6 p.m. The TV glowed with advertisements for Christmas toys. Around 8 p.m., my parents sent me to the Chippy, our local chip shop, to pick up dinner. Although I was only 10 or 11 years old, it was a normal chore for me, being only about 5 or so minutes walk away. On top of that, I lived in a very quiet neighborhood with well-lit streets. It was a chilly night. I remember I could see my breath puff out with every exhale. I was wrapped in a big, thick green coat, scarf, hat, and gloves. A funny image indeed. It was drizzling out, and there were puddles everywhere. I made it to the Chippy and was on my way back home within about 10 minutes. As I made it back to my street, a weird feeling came over me, making me feel extremely alert and on edge. It's hard to explain, but something suddenly felt off. There was a strange silence except for the light pattering of the rain all around me. The air seemed to be unusually clear and thin. No cars or passers-by, nothing but the rain. I hurried down the street toward my house with my guard way up. A few steps later, a creeping, rapidly overwhelming sense of dread fell upon me, which made the chill in the air feel like a stinging assault on my body. I stopped dead in my tracks, with my mouth agape. I saw it from a short distance away, only about 6 houses down the road from me. I couldn't tell if it was a person or a thing. It was definitely shaped vaguely like a human, but gray, slippery looking, tall and sexless with a muscular build, a large oblong head and arms noticeably longer than its legs. It turned the corner at the end of my street and was in a full sprint, running directly at me. It was as if I knew it was there before it was even in my line of sight, and suddenly it burst into view, charging at me with terrifying speed. I was frozen with fear as I gazed upon this otherworldly creature with a barely conscious curiosity. My heart was pounding against my ribcage faster than I had ever felt it before. My mind was almost completely blank. All I could see or hear was the splashing of puddles as the unearthly creature hurled itself towards me until it was within arm's reach. The last thing I remember was staring into its emotionless face. Its large, soulless eyes weren't visible to me until it was too late. I could feel the seething, malicious intent of it as it came to me. It made almost no sound other than the puddles. Somehow my memory goes black after that moment. I woke up the next morning and my dad told me that I didn't get home until after 9 p.m., which I was unfortunately bollocked for. I acknowledge that it could have all been a dream, but I remember it so well. I normally try to explain away things of this nature, but it's one of the earlier, more pure memories that I have. I was only about 10 or so years old. Well, my friend, Mr. X, I'm now creeped out by my own story and about to go to bed. Totally worth it, though. Thank you again for taking an interest and listening to my story. Best regards, Mark. Hello there, my friends. Mr. X Dreams here. So, I have a bit of a message to share with Brian, and the same goes to anyone else this might apply to. Don't attribute to yourself any label that people give you that you don't want. especially for things like the circumstances of your birth or anything outside of your own control for that matter. You all know it's extremely difficult to get me angry, but shaming or mistreating an innocent child is one of those things that will pretty much do the trick every time. I really dislike the idea of calling a kid a bastard. It has nothing to do with the kid. Don't do it. That's all I'll say on that. So I was revamping this story and I came across some of the comments from the original video, and I wanted to read them to you so that you understand the headspace I was in at the first time I read this story. What I wrote, one of my comments was, quote, "Anyone who writes you off for a memory or experience that you may have that may be extraordinary is guilty of the crime of supreme arrogance. They will be judged by the Supreme Court of Dreamers as unfit to have an opinion, and I will sentence them to 1,000 lifetimes of banishment into the realm of dreams, where I will personally ensure their mental rehabilitation." End quote. Now, that kind of tickled me. I went on to say the following, quote, "Not really though. The thing is, you have found a place where many of us are humble enough to acknowledge that just because we don't understand something, just because it does not fit into our current view of the world or how things work, doesn't mean we can't accept your experience for what it is. What's important is you're being honest with yourself. Only you know your experience. If you believe it, I have no reason not to take you at your word." End quote. So its sentiment, it was made lightheartedly, of course, but it actually still holds true today, even though I'm a very different person than I was all those years ago. It's a pretty good distillation of my thoughts on the matters of these allegedly true stories. I really see no reason to try and minimize someone's claims as long as they aren't hurting anyone else or happen to be clearly false. So, on to my commentary about the stories themselves. I often wonder about what forms of life may inhabit the far reaches of Earth's wilderness, things that remain hidden until one day they are no longer. If you look online, you'll see a long list of animals that were once literally known as cryptids. The giant squid, for example. I'm sure some of you can name a few others. As the eldest of 4 siblings myself, I can sympathize with Brian for his duty to protect the young ones. I couldn't imagine having to take a stand against a hulking beast, terrible enough to silence an entire mountainside, though. Now, about Mark's encounter in the rain with that grotesque, monstrous humanoid, I did my best to paint the picture of what Mark told me in his email, the terrifying assault on the senses. Seeing something so misshapen and hideous bounding toward you, and the only thing you hear is the light splashing of puddles. Hopefully I was able to convey that through my sound design as well. I'd like to think it was a dream, but I do have some questions. Mark sent me this message almost 5 years ago, but the other day I reached out to get an update and check on him as well. I asked him if his parents actually got the food from the chippy that he was sent out to retrieve, and what he remembered from before the encounter when he was told to go out that night. I'm trying to see if there's any reason to believe that this may have really occurred in the physical world rather than in his dreams. Unfortunately, I haven't heard back from him, but I'll update this video with a comment if I do. Now it's time to hear what the dreamers have to say about these 2 stories. Remember, if you want a chance to have your question or comment appear in a future video, or even to sponsor a video in this series, turn on notifications so you know when I do the live readings. Alright, so on to the dreamers. Myred Hesketh says, "The world can be a strange and unusual place, but also amazing and interesting." I agree, definitely. These stories are a prime example of what some people's experiences of the world look like. Cindy S. says, "My immediate thought was an alien with the second story." You know, it's an interesting idea, because I often wonder, if an alien was to come to this planet, what type of what would be the purpose of sending an alien that's basically acts like a rabid animal? Or maybe they only act like that when they get here because they get sick or something like that, like War of the Worlds style. That's an interesting idea. Ellie says, since its arms were longer than its legs, were the arms sort of dragging along the ground? That's somehow makes the whole idea of the mental image of this creature hurling itself towards the little boy coming down the street. Makes it way more terrifying if the knuckles are just bouncing and bumping up and down off the pavement as it's moving along. That sucks. I would not want to be on the receiving end of that visual in real life. Lori Long says, I find it interesting that in the second story, stories about possible ETs imply such a high degree of malice. Another interesting fold in that whole extraterrestrial concept. What's the purpose? You know, why would something that is so angry and so malevolent be running around on the streets? And on top of that, if Mark wasn't dreaming, what happened to him in that lost time? And trust me, old school dreamers know I have an ET related story personally where myself and several of my family members lost time at the same time. And so I know that's something that can definitely happen. Why it happens or how it happens, I don't know. But it's not something I really put a lot of doubt in, that a person can suffer lost time in the middle of a strange encounter with something they can't really explain, because it happened to me personally and several of my family members at the same time. So Blue Silver says, I've heard of at least 2 other stories about people encountering aliens on lonely streets, both grays. One was even supposedly taking place in my old hometown, a spot I've always been intrigued by. You might have to give us some elaboration on that one, Blue Silver. But thank you all for your comments. Very interesting stories. If you are listening right now and you've got more comments or something to add or discuss about these cryptid encounters, make sure you leave a comment down below. I'd love to see what you think. As many of you know, I pretty much respond to every single comment, every single substantive comment. You know, sometimes I just throw an emoji in there if somebody gives me a thumbs up or something like that. But yeah, I love these discussions, so keep it going. So before we get out of here, if you are still listening to this video, let me know by typing the word puddles in your comment down below. Be creative with it as well. That way I can know who the real dreamers are. Take care, my friends. Special thanks to this week's Super Chat sponsors: Ellie, Pete Hudson 44, Lori Long, Artie Facial, Master Panda, Mullem, Sleepy, Let's Read, Tariko Tomoso, Fear the Great White, Christy Hill, Ambar Chavez, Zen 2011, Brenda Whitehead, Leanne, and Jessica Bullock. Thank you all very, very much. All right. I hope you enjoyed the show. If you did, don't forget to like and share. If you made it to the very end, you're exactly the kind of subscriber I'm looking for. Don't forget to turn on those notifications. That way, you can catch the live show and discuss the stories with me. Your input might even appear in my next video. Last thing, if you heard a code word after the story, type it in a comment down below so I know who the real dreamers are. Take care, my friend. Until next time.